It is widely considered the worst naval disaster in the history of the United States Navy, a harrowing tale of administrative negligence, extreme physiological survival, and primal terror that was famously immortalized in Steven Spielberg's 1975 cinematic masterpiece, Jaws. In that film's most legendary scene, the grizzled shark hunter Quint, played with chilling intensity by Robert Shaw, delivers a bone-chilling monologue recounting the slaughter of the crew of the USS Indianapolis by a relentless school of sharks, leaving audiences to wonder if a clever Hollywood screenwriter had simply fabricated this nightmarish story to build tension. But the terrifying reality of what those young servicemen endured in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is far more gruesome, heartbreaking, and shocking than any movie could ever portray. To understand how this disaster unfolded, we have to look back to July of 1945, a time when the Second World War in Europe had already ended, but the conflict in the Pacific was raging toward a bloody and highly uncertain climax. The Portland-class heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, under the command of the highly experienced Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III, was selected for a mission of supreme national importance and absolute secrecy. The ship was tasked with transporting a mysterious, heavily guarded cargo from Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco across the vast expanse of the Pacific to the island of Tinian. And though the crew had no idea what was inside the heavy lead-lined crates lashed to the deck, they knew by the presence of armed guards that it was of vital significance to the war effort. On July 26th, the Indianapolis successfully delivered her cargo, which history would reveal to be the highly enriched uranium and internal components for Little Boy, the first operational atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima just days later, changing the course of human history forever. Having completed this historic delivery, the cruiser was ordered to sail to Guam and then onward to the Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to join the battleship USS Idaho to begin intensive training and preparations for the eventual invasion of the Japanese mainland. Because the ship's mission was deemed routine after the bomb parts were safely delivered, and because the waters between Guam and Leyte were believed by Naval Command to be relatively safe and free of enemy activity, Captain McVeigh's request for a destroyer escort was denied, and the giant heavy cruiser set sail completely alone, moving through the Philippine Sea at a steady pace of 17 knots. The weather was overcast. The seas were moderately choppy, and visibility was exceedingly poor as the night of July 29th descended. But unbeknownst to the crew, a lethal predator was lurking just beneath the surface in the form of the Japanese submarine Harrowing 58, commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto. Hashimoto spotted the silhouette of the massive American cruiser and ordered a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes to be fired, 2 of which struck the Indianapolis with devastating precision just after midnight on July 30th. The first torpedo blasted away the ship's bow, instantly killing dozens of crewmen sleeping in the forward mess deck, while the second torpedo struck midship, detonating the fuel tanks and ammunition magazines in a catastrophic explosion that instantly cut all electrical power, rendering the ship's internal communications useless and preventing a systematic evacuation order from being broadcast. In the pitch black, with water rushing in at an uncontrollable rate, the mighty warship began to list violently to starboard, taking a mere 12 minutes to capsize and plunge, nose first, into the dark ocean depths. Of the approximately 1,195 souls aboard the Indianapolis, an estimated 300 men went down with the ship, trapped in the crushing steel hull as it sank into the abyss, leaving nearly 900 men cast into the open ocean. Because the vessel sank with such terrifying speed, there was no time to launch proper lifeboats, meaning most survivors found themselves bobbing in the water, wearing nothing but standard-issue Kapok life jackets, while others clung desperately to whatever floating debris they could scramble to find. As dawn broke on that first morning, the sheer scale of their predicament became terribly clear as the sea was choked with a thick, toxic layer of black fuel oil that leaked from the shattered hull of the ship, burning the men's eyes irritating their skin and causing violent nausea as they swallowed the fouled water. To make matters worse, many of the sailors were already badly injured, suffering from severe burns, broken bones, and deep lacerations caused by the torpedo blasts. And without medical supplies, morphine, or clean bandages, the healthy could do nothing but hold the wounded in their arms, watching them slowly slip away as the salt water stung their open wounds. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the USS Indianapolis lies not in its sinking, but in the institutional failure that followed. Because before the ship plunged beneath the waves, heroic radio operators worked frantically in the dark, using backup power to transmit desperate SOS distress signals that were actually received by 3 separate naval stations. Yet due to a series of unimaginable bureaucratic blunders, none of them acted. One commander was reportedly drunk, another had ordered his men not to disturb him, and a third assumed the message was a clever Japanese deception designed to lure rescue ships into an ambush. Furthermore, because of highly rigid wartime secrecy protocols, the Indianapolis was operating under a system where her arrival was expected, but her non-arrival was not reported, meaning that when the ship failed to arrive at Leyte on July 31st as scheduled, nobody raised an alarm, nobody checked on her status, and the Navy simply assumed she had been delayed or rerouted. As a result, no search parties were dispatched, and the survivors were completely forgotten, left to drift in the middle of a vast, unforgiving ocean. By the afternoon of the first day, a new and terrifying threat emerged as the massive explosions, the thrashing of hundreds of men, and the scent of blood in the water acted as a giant dinner bell for the ocean's most opportunistic apex predator, the oceanic white-tip shark. Initially, the sharks targeted the dead, feeding on the bodies of those who had succumbed to their wounds or drowned during the sinking. But as the sun began to heat the water and the sharks grew bolder, they began to target the living. The survivors quickly realized that their only defense was solidarity, forming tight defensive circles with the wounded and weak in the center. And whenever a shark was spotted, the men would kick, splash, scream, and beat the water, trying to startle the predators away. But as the hours dragged on and exhaustion set in, individuals would inevitably drift away from the safety of the group, and the current would carry an exhausted sailor a few yards too far, prompting a dorsal fin to slice through the water, followed by a sudden, frantic struggle and a blood-curdling scream as the water turned a deep crimson, and then, a few agonizing seconds later, the empty life jacket would bob back up to the surface. As day 2 bled into day 3, the physical torture reached a breaking point, and dehydration became as deadly as the sharks, because under a relentless, blazing tropical sun, the temperatures soared. The salt water began to blister the men's faces, and the lack of fresh water became unbearable. The older, seasoned sailors warned the younger crewmen that drinking salt water was a death sentence, but many could not resist, and within hours of drinking the ocean water, the salt poisoned their kidneys and brains, driving the men into a state of wild, violent delirium. They began to hallucinate vividly, claiming they could see the Indianapolis floating just below the surface, offering cold beer and fresh water, leading many to unbuckle their life jackets and swim down to reach it, never to return, while others became violently paranoid, believing their fellow crewmates were Japanese spies, sparking frantic knife fights in the water that shattered the delicate cohesion of the survival circles. By the third day, a few survivors managed to lash floating wooden crates together, which gave them a dry surface to wring out their waterlogged life vests and a few rotten potatoes to eat. But by the fourth day, the survivors had lost all hope, their life jackets barely keeping their mouths above the surface as they waited to die. But at 11 o'clock in the morning on August 2nd, a miracle occurred when Lieutenant Wilbur C. Gwynn, piloting a Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol, happened to look down and spot a massive oil slick, and suspecting an enemy submarine, he flew lower, only to discover hundreds of human beings waving weakly from the water. What followed was a frantic, heroic rescue operation, as seaplane pilot Adrian Marks flew to the scene and, witnessing the ongoing shark attacks, ignored naval regulations and landed his plane in the rough, heavy swells, taxiing across the water to pull survivors out of the sea, packing the fuselage completely full and even tying men to the wings of the plane with parachute cords to save 56 lives before nightfall. The destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle soon arrived, shining its searchlights into the night sky to give the survivors hope, risking itself to submarine attacks to pull the final living men from the water. But of the nearly 1,200 men who set sail from Tinian, only 317 survived the ordeal. The Navy, deeply embarrassed by the catastrophic failure to notice the ship's disappearance, delayed releasing the news of the tragedy to the public until August 15, 1945, the exact day President Harry S. Truman announced the surrender of Japan, meaning the immense tragedy was instantly swallowed by the euphoria of victory, and Captain McVeigh was court-martialed and scapegoated, a stain on his honor that haunted him until his tragic suicide in 1968, before he was finally exonerated by the United States government in the year 2000, leaving the story of the USS Indianapolis as a chilling monument to human error, raw survival, and the dark, unforgiving depths of the sea.